What if I told you that one of the biggest mistakes people make after being hurt by a narcissist is believing that the narcissist feels absolutely nothing? It's easy to assume they walk away without guilt, regret, or emotional consequences. But the truth is far more complicated, and understanding it could completely change the way you heal. Stay with me until the very end, because the final point explains why waiting for a narcissist to admit what they feel often keeps survivors emotionally trapped. Once you understand what's really happening beneath the surface, you'll stop looking to them for closure and start finding it within yourself. One of the biggest misconceptions about narcissistic relationships is the belief that when the relationship ends, the narcissist is heartbroken because they lost you as a person. While every individual is different, what often causes the strongest emotional reaction is not necessarily the loss of the relationship itself, but the loss of control they once had over it. During the relationship, they may have become accustomed to influencing your emotions, predicting your reactions, and knowing that their words or actions could shape your decisions. This sense of influence can become deeply woven into the dynamic. When that influence begins to disappear, it can feel far more unsettling to them than many people realize. Throughout the relationship, you may have found yourself explaining your choices, defending your feelings, seeking their approval, or trying to repair conflicts that you did not create. Over time, these patterns taught the narcissist that they could expect certain responses from you. They knew that if they withdrew affection, you might chase them. If they criticized you, you might work harder to prove your worth. If they created conflict, you would often be the one trying to restore peace. These predictable reactions gave them a sense of emotional certainty and control. It wasn't necessarily about genuine intimacy. It was about knowing they could influence the emotional direction of the relationship. Everything changes when those familiar patterns stop. You no longer rush to explain yourself. You stop seeking validation. You begin setting boundaries, making decisions independently, and refusing to participate in unhealthy cycles. Suddenly, the narcissist is faced with something they did not expect: uncertainty. They can no longer predict your next move or rely on the same emotional responses that once gave them a sense of control. This unexpected shift may lead them to reach out unexpectedly, become unusually charming, criticize you more intensely, or attempt to pull you back into familiar dynamics. These behaviors are often attempts to restore the influence they feel slipping away rather than clear evidence of healthy love or accountability. Understanding this distinction can be incredibly freeing because it helps you stop misinterpreting every attempt to reconnect as proof of genuine change. Their reaction may be more about losing access to the role they once played in your emotional life than about truly understanding the pain they caused. Recognizing this allows you to focus less on decoding their behavior and more on protecting your own healing. The moment you stop measuring your value by how much control someone wants to regain over you is the moment you begin reclaiming your emotional independence and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional power. One of the most misunderstood emotional experiences in narcissistic behavior is the difference between guilt and shame. In healthy relationships, when someone realizes they have hurt another person, guilt says, "I made a mistake," or "I hurt someone and I want to make it right." It can motivate accountability, sincere apologies, and meaningful change. Shame, however, feels very different. Instead of focusing on the behavior, it threatens the person's entire self-image. It creates the painful belief that admitting a mistake means admitting they are fundamentally flawed or unworthy. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, this feeling can be so overwhelming that they instinctively try to escape it rather than face it. When a narcissistic person is confronted with the consequences of their behavior, they may briefly experience discomfort or embarrassment. For a moment, they may recognize that something they did was harmful. But instead of sitting with those uncomfortable emotions and reflecting on them, they often protect themselves through psychological defenses. They deny what happened, minimize the impact of their actions, rewrite the story, or quickly shift the blame onto someone else. Rather than saying, "I hurt you," they may say, "You made me act that way," or "You're too sensitive," or "You're remembering it wrong." These responses are not necessarily proof that they feel nothing. More often, they are attempts to avoid emotions that threaten the image they work so hard to maintain. This is why many survivors become confused. They wonder how someone can cause so much pain and then act as though nothing happened. The absence of an apology is often interpreted as the absence of emotion, but those are not always the same thing. A person may feel uncomfortable, ashamed, or threatened without being emotionally healthy enough to acknowledge those feelings honestly. Instead of accepting responsibility, they redirect the emotional discomfort outward by criticizing, blaming, or discrediting the very person they hurt. Understanding this pattern is important because it helps you stop waiting for an apology that may never come. If admitting wrongdoing feels like a threat to their identity, they may continue protecting themselves instead of repairing the relationship. That does not erase the pain they caused, nor does it excuse their behavior. It simply explains why accountability can be so difficult for someone whose self-worth depends on appearing superior or faultless. Your healing begins when you realize that their inability to face their own shame is not evidence that your pain was insignificant. It is evidence of their emotional limitations, and those limitations are theirs to confront, not yours to carry. One of the moments that often affects a narcissistic person more than they will ever admit is when you stop chasing them. During the relationship, a familiar pattern may have developed where you were always the one trying to repair the connection. After an argument, you reached out first. When they became distant, you searched for answers. If they criticized you or withdrew affection, you worked even harder to prove your love, your loyalty, or your commitment. Over time, this pattern became predictable. They learned that no matter how much conflict they created, you would likely return, explain yourself, apologize, or try to restore the relationship. That predictability gave them a sense of emotional certainty and reinforced the belief that they could always regain your attention. Everything changes when that pattern suddenly stops. You no longer send long messages explaining your feelings. You stop checking whether they have called or texted. You stop looking for hidden meanings in every social media post or waiting for signs that they miss you. Instead of chasing closure from them, you begin creating closure for yourself. Your focus gradually shifts from trying to understand their behavior to understanding your own needs, your own healing, and your own future. This quiet change can be deeply unsettling because it removes the emotional role they had come to expect you to play. A narcissistic person may respond to this shift in different ways. Some may suddenly reach out with unexpected kindness, acting as though nothing ever happened. Others may criticize you more intensely, attempt to make you jealous, or spread negative stories about you to mutual friends. Some may even alternate between warmth and hostility, hoping one of those approaches will pull you back into familiar emotional patterns. These reactions are often less about genuine emotional growth and more about testing whether they still have access to your attention. When they discover that your emotional world no longer revolves around them, it can challenge the sense of influence they once relied upon. The most important transformation, however, is not what happens to them. It is what happens to you. The moment you stop chasing someone who has repeatedly shown you inconsistency, manipulation, or disrespect, you begin reclaiming your self-respect. You realize that love should never require endless pursuit of someone who continually moves further away. Instead of measuring your worth by whether they return, You begin measuring your progress by how peacefully you can move forward. That shift changes everything. It reminds you that your value does not increase because someone finally notices your absence. Your value has always existed, and the decision to stop chasing simply allows you to recognize it. One of the greatest misunderstandings about narcissistic people is that the confidence they project is always genuine. On the surface, they may appear fearless, self-assured, and completely unaffected by criticism or rejection. They often speak with certainty, present themselves as superior, and behave as though they are always in control. To the people around them, this confidence can seem unshakable, but appearances can be deceiving. In many cases, the image they work so hard to maintain is much more fragile than it seems. Their confidence often depends heavily on external validation, admiration, attention, or the ability to influence the people around them. When those sources begin to disappear, deeper insecurities may begin to surface. During the relationship, you may have unknowingly contributed to that sense of stability by offering reassurance, attention, forgiveness, or emotional availability. Even when the relationship was unhealthy, your reactions confirmed that they still occupied an important place in your emotional world. Whether you were defending yourself, seeking their approval, or trying to repair the relationship, your focus remained on them. This attention could reinforce the image they had created of themselves as someone who always remained important, influential, or impossible to replace. When you begin stepping away from those patterns, the emotional landscape changes. You stop needing their approval to feel confident. You stop seeking validation for your choices and begin trusting your own judgment. As your attention shifts toward your own healing, the admiration or emotional focus they once relied upon becomes less available. This can expose insecurities they prefer not to acknowledge. Rather than admitting they feel uncertain or vulnerable, they may react by exaggerating their achievements, seeking admiration from new people, criticizing you more harshly, or presenting an image of perfect happiness. These behaviors often serve to protect the self-image they feel is being challenged. Understanding this dynamic is important because it helps you see that outward confidence does not always reflect inner emotional security. A person who constantly needs to prove their superiority, seek admiration, or maintain control may be protecting themselves from feelings they find difficult to tolerate. This does not excuse hurtful behavior, nor should it encourage you to return to an unhealthy relationship. Instead, it reminds you that another person's emotional struggles are not yours to fix. Your responsibility is not to rebuild someone else's fragile self-image. It is to rebuild your own sense of peace, confidence, and self-worth. As you grow stronger and more emotionally grounded, you begin realizing that genuine confidence does not come from controlling others or seeking constant validation. It comes from knowing who you are, accepting your imperfections, and finding your value from within rather than depending on someone else's attention to feel complete. One of the more unexpected things that can happen after you stop engaging with a narcissistic person is that they become curious about what has changed. During the relationship, they may have become very familiar with your emotional patterns. They knew that certain comments would upset you, certain behaviors would make you chase them, and certain situations would lead you to seek reassurance or try to repair the relationship. Over time, your reactions became predictable, and that predictability gave them a sense of certainty. They believed they understood exactly how to get your attention and how you would respond whenever conflict arose. When you begin healing, however, those familiar patterns start to disappear. You no longer reply immediately to every message. You stop arguing over every accusation and stop trying to convince them to see your point of view. Instead of chasing after moments of approval or desperately trying to fix every misunderstanding, you become calmer and more emotionally grounded. You start making decisions based on your own well-being rather than on fear of losing the relationship. This change often creates something the narcissistic person is not accustomed to experiencing: uncertainty. They may quietly wonder why their usual tactics are no longer producing the same results. That curiosity can show itself in many different ways. They may unexpectedly reach out after a long period of silence, ask mutual friends about you, interact with your social media in subtle ways, or suddenly become unusually polite or charming. Others may test your boundaries with small comments or indirect messages to see whether you will respond the way you once did. These behaviors are not always signs of deep reflection or personal growth. More often, they are attempts to understand why the emotional dynamic has changed and whether they still have the same influence they once believed they had. The important thing to remember is that their curiosity does not have to become your responsibility. You do not owe anyone an explanation for your healing or your boundaries. Your progress is not something that needs to be justified or announced. The more you continue focusing on your own emotional health, the less important their questions become. Instead of wondering why they are suddenly interested in you again, you begin asking a much healthier question: am I continuing to make choices that protect my peace? That shift keeps your attention where it belongs, on your own recovery rather than on someone else's reactions. True healing is not measured by whether a narcissistic person becomes curious about your life. It is measured by the moment their curiosity no longer determines how you choose to live yours. One of the most difficult things for a narcissistic person to admit is genuine regret when doing so threatens the image they have of themselves. In healthy relationships, admitting a mistake can strengthen trust because it shows honesty, humility, and a willingness to grow. A sincere apology acknowledges the harm that was done and accepts responsibility without making excuses. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, however, admitting significant wrongdoing can feel much more threatening. It may seem as though accepting responsibility would damage the carefully constructed image they work so hard to protect. Rather than seeing an apology as a sign of strength, they may experience it as a sign of weakness or failure. This is one reason many survivors spend years waiting for an apology that never arrives. They believe that if the narcissistic person truly understood the pain they caused, they would eventually admit it. But instead of taking responsibility, the narcissist may deny what happened, minimize your experience, rewrite the story, or insist that you misunderstood their intentions. They may say things like, "You're too sensitive, that never happened," or "You made me react that way." These responses can be deeply painful because they leave you feeling unseen and unheard. You may begin questioning your own memories or wondering whether your feelings are somehow unreasonable. The truth is that a narcissistic person may experience moments of discomfort, embarrassment, or even regret, but those emotions are often hidden beneath powerful defense mechanisms. Instead of allowing themselves to fully acknowledge the harm they caused, they may quickly redirect the conversation, criticize you, or focus on your mistakes instead. By doing this, they avoid confronting emotions that feel too threatening to their self-image. This does not mean they are incapable of feeling anything. It means they may lack the emotional capacity or willingness to face those feelings honestly and translate them into genuine accountability. Understanding this can be incredibly liberating because it shifts your focus away from waiting for validation that may never come. Your healing does not have to depend on someone else's apology or admission of guilt. The reality of what you experienced does not become less true simply because another person refuses to acknowledge it. Closure begins when you stop asking whether they finally understand your pain and start recognizing that your experiences, your emotions, and your healing are valid regardless of their response. Real peace comes from accepting that another person's inability to admit regret is a reflection of their emotional limitations, not a reflection of your worth or the reality of what you lived through. One of the deepest emotions a narcissistic person may struggle to acknowledge is the fear of becoming irrelevant in the life of someone they once influenced. During the relationship, they may have become accustomed to being the center of your emotional world. Your attention, your reactions, your decisions, and even your daily thoughts often revolved around the relationship. Whether the interactions were loving, confusing, or painful, they knew they occupied an important place in your mind. That emotional significance can become part of the dynamic they rely on, because it reinforces the belief that they will always have an impact on your life. Everything begins to change when you genuinely move forward. You stop checking your phone to see if they have contacted you. You no longer replay old conversations or search for hidden meanings behind their actions. Instead of wondering whether they miss you, your attention turns toward rebuilding your own life. You invest in friendships that bring you peace, pursue goals that inspire you, and create routines that support your emotional well-being. Gradually, the narcissistic person is no longer the main character in your story. They become part of your past rather than the focus of your present. This shift can be difficult for someone who has relied on remaining emotionally significant. They may not openly admit feeling affected, but they can struggle with the realization that they no longer occupy the same space in your life. In response, they may unexpectedly reach out, attempt to remind you of shared memories, become unusually friendly, or even create unnecessary drama in an effort to draw your attention back to them. In some cases, they may criticize your progress or question your decisions because acknowledging your independence would require accepting that they no longer hold the same influence they once did. The most important part of this journey is recognizing that your healing is not about making a narcissistic person feel forgotten or proving that you have moved on better than they have. It is about reclaiming your own emotional freedom. True healing happens when your happiness is no longer connected to whether they think about you, miss you, or regret losing you. You stop measuring your progress by their reactions and start measuring it by your own peace of mind. As your confidence grows, you realize that your future does not need to be built around someone else's approval or attention. The greatest transformation is not that a narcissistic person may fear becoming irrelevant. It is that you finally reach a place where their role in your life no longer defines your identity, your self-worth, or your ability to experience joy. That quiet freedom is something no one can take from you, and it becomes the strongest evidence that you have truly begun to heal. Understanding what narcissists may feel after hurting someone is not about decoding every behavior or searching for hidden signs that they secretly care. It is about recognizing that human emotions are often more complicated than they appear on the surface. A narcissistic person may experience insecurity, shame, frustration, or fear, but those feelings are frequently hidden beneath denial, blame, defensiveness, or attempts to regain control. The most important lesson is this: their inner emotional world is not your responsibility to solve. Whether they admit regret, acknowledge your pain, or continue avoiding accountability, your healing cannot depend on their willingness to change. Waiting for the perfect apology or the perfect confession often keeps you emotionally connected to the very person you're trying to recover from. Real freedom begins when you stop measuring your progress by what they feel and start measuring it by what you are rebuilding within yourself. Your peace, your confidence, your boundaries, and your ability to trust yourself again. In the end, the greatest victory isn't discovering what a narcissist secretly feels after hurting you. It's reaching the point where their unspoken emotions no longer determine your happiness, your self-worth, or your future.